Imagine standing in the middle of a vast, silent desert. No roads, no electricity, no signal on your phone, obviously. Just thousands of miles of raw, untamed land stretching in every direction. Mountains so tall they seem to scrape the clouds. Valleys so deep they swallow rivers whole. Plains so wide that settlers who crossed them in covered wagons often went mad from the emptiness. Now imagine someone looks at all of that, every mountain, every canyon, every raging river, and says, "We're going to drive a railroad straight through this. Not around it. Not over it. Through it. And not just a local line connecting two nearby cities. We're talking about a Transcontinental Railroad, a steel spine stretching nearly 1,800 miles from the Missouri River, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, linking the eastern United States to California, transforming a fractured, war-torn nation into something the world had never seen before. This is not just the story of a railroad. This is the story of the railroad that built modern America. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, had incredible timing, because today we are diving into one of the most epic, dramatic, controversial, and absolutely jaw-dropping engineering and human stories in the history of civilization. We're talking about the first transcontinental railroad completed in 1869, connecting the United States from coast to coast for the first time in history. Now, you might think you know this story. Maybe you've seen a painting of the famous Golden Spike ceremony, two locomotives facing each other on a lonely Utah plateau. Maybe you've read a few lines about it in a history textbook. Maybe you've seen a documentary or two. But I promise you what we're going to explore today goes way deeper than anything you've seen before. We're going to talk about the absolute madness of the political and financial world that made this railroad possible and nearly destroyed it. The tens of thousands of workers, Irish immigrants fleeing famine, Chinese laborers who were paid less and respected even less, who broke their bodies and gave their lives to drive steel through mountains. The engineering impossibilities that became realities through sheer human stubbornness. The corruption so enormous it almost brought down the United States government. Finally, what this railroad actually did to America, the cities it created, the native nations it destroyed, the economy it transformed, and the country it forged. So make yourself comfortable. Grab your coffee, your tea, whatever keeps you going, because we've got a lot of ground to cover. To understand why the Transcontinental Railroad was built, you have to understand what the United States looked like before it existed. And the picture is not pretty. It's 1860. The country is essentially two different nations, barely held together by a shared name. The East Coast with its cities, factories, ports, and established financial networks is connected, wealthy for some, and politically powerful. But go west of the Mississippi River, and you enter a world that the federal government barely controls. According to historian David Howard Bain in his landmark book Empire Express, the journey from New York to California in the 1850s was not just difficult. It was genuinely life-threatening, no matter which route you chose. You had three main options. Option 1. Take a ship from New York, sail all the way around the southern tip of South America, Cape Horn, and then sail back up to San Francisco. Total distance? Roughly 18,000 miles. Total time? Anywhere from 4 to 8 months. And that's if the storms around Cape Horn didn't sink you, which they frequently did. Option 2. Sail to Panama, cross the jungle on foot or by mule through one of the most disease-ridden landscapes on Earth, and then catch another ship on the Pacific side. This was faster, maybe 6 weeks, but cholera, malaria, and yellow fever killed passengers at alarming rates. Option 3. Join a wagon train and spend 5 to 6 months crossing 2,000 miles of prairies, deserts, and mountain ranges in a wooden wagon. Thousands of immigrants did this. Thousands of them also died from disease, from starvation, from accidents, from violence. The gold rush of 1849 had brought hundreds of thousands of people to California, practically overnight. But connecting California and all the territories in between to the rest of the United States was proving nearly impossible. And then came the war. The Civil War, which began in 1861, made something crystal clear to President Abraham Lincoln and a Republican-dominated Congress. The United States could not afford to be geographically fragmented. If the nation was going to survive not just the war, but the peace that would follow it, needed to be physically connected at a level never before achieved. A railroad across the continent wasn't just a business idea. It was a national security imperative. As historian Stephen E. Ambrose explains in his remarkable book, Nothing Like It in the World, which should honestly be required reading for every American, Lincoln was obsessed with the idea of the Transcontinental Railroad even before the war began. He saw it as the project that would bind the nation together, pull California firmly into the Union, and open the interior West to settlement and economic development. In July 1862, in the middle of the Civil War, while soldiers were dying by the thousands, Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law. This was extraordinary. The federal government was broke, fighting the most expensive war in American history up to that point, and yet Congress passed legislation to fund the construction of a railroad that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and cross terrain that no engineer had ever fully surveyed. The act created two companies to build the railroad from opposite directions. The Central Pacific Railroad, based in Sacramento, California, would build eastward from the Pacific coast. The Union Pacific Railroad, based in the east, would build westward from the Missouri River. They would meet somewhere in the middle, wherever that turned out to be. And here's where things get immediately, gloriously complicated. The act offered these companies enormous incentives. For every mile of track laid, they would receive government bonds, essentially loans ranging from $16,000 per mile on flat land to $48,000 per mile through mountains. They would also receive land grants, strips of public land 10 miles wide on either side of the track, which they could sell to settlers and developers. On paper, this seemed like a generous but sensible arrangement. In practice, as we'll see, it created one of the most corrupt and chaotic construction projects in human history. But before we get to the corruption, fraud, and congressional scandal, let's meet the people who actually decided to do this thing. In Sacramento, California, 4 businessmen formed the Central Pacific Railroad Company. History knows them as the Big Four. And while that sounds like a sports team, their actual story involves more betrayal, greed, and ambition than most sports dramas could handle. There was Leland Stanford, a lawyer turned politician who would become governor of California and later found Stanford University. Stanford was the political face of the operation, charming, well-connected, excellent at working a room, less excellent at actual railroad construction. There was Collis P. Huntington, arguably the most brilliant and ruthless of the 4. Huntington was a hardware store merchant who had an almost supernatural ability to raise money, lobby politicians, and outmaneuver competitors. He would spend years in Washington, D.C., essentially acting as the company's full-time influence peddler. The historian Richard White, in his extraordinary book Railroaded, describes Huntington as a man who treated corruption not as a moral failure, but as a business tool efficient, necessary, and utterly devoid of sentiment. There was Mark Hopkins, the detail man, the numbers person, deeply frugal in a way that was almost comical, given the enormous sums flowing through the company. Hopkins is the least glamorous of the 4, but arguably the one who kept the financial machinery from completely imploding. And there was Charles Crocker, the construction boss. Big, loud, tireless, with a volcanic temper and an absolute genius for logistics. Crocker would become the driving force behind the actual physical construction of the railroad, and his decisions, including one particularly consequential one about labor, would change the demographics of California forever. The Union Pacific personalities in conflict. On the eastern end, the Union Pacific was a more chaotic enterprise, politically appointed and financially murky from the start. The key figures included Thomas Durant, a physician who had reinvented himself as a financier and railroad promoter. Durant was brilliant, flamboyant, and almost pathologically dishonest. He wore a fur coat, he threw legendary parties, he manipulated stock prices. He had a genius for making money, specifically for making money for Thomas Durant. Durant's great contribution to the project, and his great corruption, was his involvement in the Credit Mobilier Company, which we will absolutely come back to because it's one of the greatest financial scandals in American history. Working under Durant, and frequently fighting with him, was a remarkable series of construction managers, most notably the brothers Grenville Dodge, and the Casement brothers, Jack and Dan Casement, who actually managed the day-to-day hell of building a railroad across the Great Plains and into the mountains. Grenville Dodge was a Civil War general who brought military discipline to railroad construction. According to historian Maury Klein in his biography Union Pacific Birth of a Railroad, Dodge was one of the most important figures in the entire project. A man who could survey mountain passes, manage thousands of workers, negotiate with Native American tribes, and fight off Durant's financial meddling, all more or less simultaneously. Hey, real quick, if you've made it this far and you're enjoying this journey, do me a huge favor, hit that like button right now. Seriously, it takes literally half a second, and it makes an enormous difference in getting this video to more people who love history just like you do. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Click subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a video. We cover stories like this every week. Deep dives into the moments, the decisions, and the people that actually shaped the world we live in. Also, drop a comment down below what part of this story surprises you the most so far. I read every single comment, I genuinely do, and I love hearing what you think. Alright, back to the railroad, because things are about to get very intense. Here's the thing about the Transcontinental Railroad, that the Golden Spike ceremony tends to obscure the men celebrating that day, and their top hats and frock coats did not build that railroad. The railroad was built by the hands, backs, and blood of tens of thousands of working men, many of them immigrants who received almost none of the glory, much of the suffering, and, in some cases, not even a safe acknowledgement that they existed. Let's start with the Central Pacific's workforce, because this is one of the most important and underappreciated stories in American labor history. The Chinese workers. When construction on the Central Pacific began in 1863, Charles Crocker initially relied on Irish immigrant workers, who were the default labor force for railroad construction at the time. But there weren't enough of them in California, and the ones available often quit, struck for higher wages, or were simply too expensive. Crocker's superintendent of construction, James Strobridge, was initially resistant to using Chinese workers, dismissing them as too small and too physically delicate for the brutal work of railroad construction. Crocker overruled him and hired 50 Chinese workers as an experiment. Within weeks, Strobridge had reversed his position entirely. The Chinese workers, many of them from Guangdong province, who had come to California during the gold rush and its aftermath, proved to be extraordinary. They were disciplined, organized, and willing to work in conditions that other laborers refused. According to the Chinese Historical Society of America, and documented extensively in Gordon Chang's landmark work, Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the Chinese workers operated in organized teams with their own cooks and supplies, worked longer hours than other crews, and ultimately carried the Central Pacific through its most technically demanding construction. At the peak of construction, the Central Pacific had approximately 12,000 to 15,000 Chinese workers on its payroll, representing somewhere between 80 and 90% of the total workforce. These men tunneled through the Sierra Nevada mountains' solid granite, using hand drills and black powder. They were lowered in wicker baskets down sheer cliff faces to place charges. They worked through Sierra Nevada winters so brutal that entire work camps were buried under 40 feet of snow, with workers tunneling through avalanche debris to continue their shifts. They were paid $26 to $35 per month, compared to white workers who received $35 per month plus room and board. The Chinese workers paid for their own food and housing out of their wages. In the summer of 1867, approximately 2,000 Chinese workers went on strike, demanding equal pay with white workers, shorter hours, and better working conditions. Their strike lasted a week before being broken when Crocker cut off their food supply. They returned to work without any of their demands met. According to historian Shelley Fishkin, and documented in congressional research from the U.S. Senate, when the railroad was completed, the Chinese workers were not invited to the Golden Spike ceremony. They were essentially erased from the official record of what they had built. It would take over 150 years until 2019, when the U.S. Senate passed a resolution formally recognizing the contributions of Chinese workers to the Transcontinental Railroad for that erasure to be officially acknowledged. The Irish workers and the Union Pacific. On the eastern end, the Union Pacific relied heavily on Irish immigrant workers, many of them veterans of the Civil War, both Union and Confederate, who found that their wartime skills translated well to the organized quasi-military culture of railroad construction. These men, the track gangs, worked in a brutally efficient assembly line that Grenville Dodge had essentially designed from his military experience. According to journalist and historian D. Brown in Hear That Lonesome Whistle Blow, the Union Pacific's track gangs could lay up to 4 miles of track per day on flat terrain, a pace that was considered almost superhuman at the time. The Irish workers faced their own dangers: scalding water from burst locomotive boilers, collapsing embankments, and most terrifyingly raids by Plains Indian tribes who understood exactly what this railroad represented for their way of life. Because here is the brutal truth that no celebratory account of the railroad can ignore: the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was not just an engineering project, it was also a weapon of conquest. The Native Americans, the other side of the railroad. As the Union Pacific pushed west across the Great Plains, it cut directly through the territories of the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other nations that had treaties with the United States government guaranteeing their sovereignty over these lands. The railroad didn't just cross their territory, it brought with it the infrastructure of destruction towns, settlers, hunters, and ultimately the systematic slaughter of the American bison. The bison, the buffalo, was not just a food source for Plains nations. It was the foundation of their entire civilization: clothing, shelter, tools, spiritual practice. Tens of millions of bison roamed the Great Plains before the railroad. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained. Professional hunters, transported by the railroad, killed bison by the millions, sometimes shooting them from moving train cars as a form of entertainment. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who commanded the military division of the Missouri during this period, explicitly encouraged the killing of the bison as a military strategy, writing in communications documented by the National Archives that the destruction of the bison was the quickest way to force the Indians to be peaceful. The railroad enabled a genocide both of a species and, effectively, of a way of life. Native resistance was fierce, courageous, and ultimately futile against the combination of military force and the railroad's unstoppable logistics. Raids on work crews slowed construction but could not stop it. The wars that followed: the Great Sioux War, the Red River War, the countless other conflicts of the late 1860s and 1870s were, in a real sense, wars about what the railroad represented: the end of one America and the beginning of another. This is history that deserves to be told fully and honestly. The railroad was simultaneously one of the greatest achievements in American history and one of the instruments of its greatest crimes. Let's talk about the actual engineering, because even setting aside the human stories, the physical feat of building this railroad was so audacious that engineers today, with GPS, computers, and modern equipment, look at what was accomplished in the 1860s and genuinely struggle to believe it. The Sierra Nevada Central Pacific's mountain. The Central Pacific's first great challenge was the Sierra Nevada mountain range, a wall of granite rising over 7,000 feet above the California Valley floor, with passes so steep that early surveyors reported they were simply uncrossable by railroad. The key figure in solving this problem was Theodore Judah, a brilliant young engineer who had become so obsessed with the idea of a transcontinental railroad that his colleagues called him Crazy Judah. Judah spent years personally hiking through the Sierra Nevada, searching for a viable route. In 1860, he found one: Donner Pass, at an elevation of about 7,000 feet, the same pass where the Donner Party had met its terrible fate just 14 years earlier. According to accounts documented in John Hoyt Williams' book A Great and Shining Road, Judah's route through Donner Pass was still an enormous engineering challenge, but it was the best available option. Tragically, Judah would not live to see the railroad completed. He died of typhoid fever in 1863, still fighting with the Big Four over control of the company he had helped create. The construction through the Sierra Nevada required boring 15 tunnels through solid granite, the longest and most difficult of which was Summit Tunnel, at 1,659 feet long, bored through pure granite at an elevation of over 7,000 feet. The workers attacked the tunnel from both ends simultaneously, drilling by hand black powder charges, then hand drills, then more black powder advancing, sometimes only 8 inches per day. To speed up the process, the Central Pacific's engineers experimented with nitroglycerin, a new and terrifyingly unstable explosive that was far more powerful than black powder. Nitroglycerin was so dangerous that several workers were killed in accidental explosions before the engineers developed safer handling procedures. But it worked once the crews learned to use it without blowing themselves up. The rate of progress roughly doubled. The winter of 1866–67 was one of the worst on record in the Sierra Nevada. 44 storms dropped snow measured in feet, sometimes dozens of feet on the construction sites. Workers died in avalanches. Entire camps disappeared under snowdrifts. Rather than stop, the Chinese workers and their supervisors developed an extraordinary solution. They continued working underground, in tunnels dug beneath the snow, emerging only to move blasted rock. They built a city of ice, essentially cooking, eating, sleeping, and working beneath 20 to 40 feet of snow, connected by underground passages, heated by improvised stoves. It was one of the most remarkable examples of human adaptation under impossible conditions in the history of construction. Cape Horn, the Clifftop Railroad. One of the most breathtaking engineering challenges on the entire route was a section called Cape Horn, a point where the Central Pacific's planned route ran along the face of a sheer granite cliff, 1,400 feet above the American River Canyon, with absolutely no ledge or natural shelf for the workers to stand on. The solution was, by any measure, extraordinary. Chinese workers were lowered in wicker or rope baskets from the top of the cliff, where they drilled holes in the granite face, placed black powder charges, lit the fuses, and were then, if they were lucky, pulled up fast enough to avoid the blast. Inch by inch, explosion by explosion, they carved a ledge out of solid rock, wide enough for a railroad track, along the face of a cliff that had been considered completely impassable. There is a photograph taken from across the canyon that shows the finished ledge at Cape Horn, a thin, impossibly precise line cut into the face of a vertical rock wall, thousands of feet above the river. Every time I see it, I can't quite believe it's real. The desert surviving the Great Basin. After descending the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, the Central Pacific entered Nevada and traded the danger of granite mountains for the danger of the Great Basin desert, scorching heat in summer, bitter cold in winter, and almost no water anywhere. Getting water to the workers required the construction of water trains, railroad cars carrying tanks of water shipped in from hundreds of miles away. The cost was enormous. The logistics were a daily nightmare, and the pace of construction that Crocker demanded never slowed. The Great Plains Union Pacific's challenge. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific was facing its own engineering challenges on the other side of the continent, though of a different kind. The Great Plains seemed easy compared to the Sierra Nevada flat, open, relatively straightforward terrain, but relatively straightforward in the context of 19th century railroad construction still meant dealing with rivers that flooded without warning, ground that was frozen solid for months, and then turned to mud, and the constant threat of attack from native warriors who understood that every mile of track was another nail in the coffin of their way of life. The Union Pacific's construction through Wyoming and into Utah required crossing multiple mountain ranges, bridging the Green River, and navigating the geological chaos of the Wasatch Range, all while maintaining the brutal pace that Thomas Durant and the financial incentives of the Pacific Railroad Act demanded. The engineering of the Union Pacific's bridges was particularly notable. The company's chief engineer, Grenville Dodge, designed and supervised the construction of dozens of bridges across rivers and canyons, some of them so large and complex that experienced engineers back east predicted they would collapse within months. They didn't. Okay, I have to stop here for a second because if you are watching this and your mind is not completely blown by what these people accomplished with their hands, with 1860s technology, I need to know that you're okay. These workers, Chinese immigrants, Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, engineers with slide rules instead of computers. They carved railroads out of granite cliffs. They tunneled through mountains in blizzards. They survived on water shipped hundreds of miles through desert with their hands. If you're as amazed by this as I am, please smash that like button. Let me know in the comments if you could go back in time and witness any moment in this story. Which one would it be? Would it be watching the Chinese workers drill through Summit Tunnel? Would it be the moment the two locomotives finally faced each other at Promontory Summit? Tell me in the comments, I genuinely want to know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're missing out on stories just like this every single week. Hit subscribe. Let's keep exploring history together. Alright, we need to talk about the money, because this is where things go absolutely sideways. Here's a question that should bother you, given everything we've discussed so far. The federal government gave the railroad companies extraordinary amounts of money and land to build this railroad. The companies were receiving tens of thousands of dollars per mile in government bonds, plus millions of acres in land grants. And yet, both the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific were constantly crying poverty, constantly lobbying for more money, constantly reporting financial difficulties. Where was all the money going? The answer in the case of the Union Pacific, at least, was a construction company called Crédit Mobilier of America. Here's how the scheme worked, and it's worth understanding carefully because it's one of the most elegant frauds in American history. Thomas Durant and his associates controlled the Union Pacific Railroad. They also secretly controlled a separate construction company, the Crédit Mobilier, which they had essentially purchased and repurposed as a vehicle for fraud. The Union Pacific hired the Crédit Mobilier to do the actual construction work on the railroad. The price? Wildly, obscenely inflated, according to investigations documented by the U.S. House of Representatives Committee that later investigated the scandal. Crédit Mobilier charged the Union Pacific approximately $94 million for work that actually cost somewhere between $44 million and $50 million. The difference, $44 to $50 million, went directly into the pockets of the men who controlled both the Union Pacific and Crédit Mobilier. In 1860s dollars. That's billions of dollars in today's money. But wait, it gets worse. To prevent Congress from investigating this arrangement, the men behind Crédit Mobilier distributed shares of the company to key members of Congress. According to the 1873 congressional investigation, which is one of the most damning documents in American political history, prominent congressmen received Crédit Mobilier stock at below market prices, essentially as bribes to look the other way. Among those implicated was Schuyler Colfax, the Vice President of the United States, and James Garfield, who would later become president, and dozens of other senators and representatives. The scandal broke publicly in 1872 when journalist Henry Adams, yes, the grandson and great-grandson of presidents, and his colleague Charles Francis Adams helped expose the scheme through reporting in the New York Sun and subsequent congressional testimony. The political fallout was enormous. Reputations were destroyed. Careers ended. But here's the infuriating truth. No one went to prison. No one gave the money back. The statute of limitations had expired on most of the fraud. The men who had stolen tens of millions of dollars from the American public essentially walked away. The Crédit Mobilier scandal became a defining symbol of the Gilded Age, the era of extraordinary economic growth and equally extraordinary corruption that followed the Civil War, an era that Mark Twain famously named in his 1873 satirical novel of the same title. The Central Pacific, for its part, ran its own version of the same scheme through a construction company called the Contract and Finance Company, conveniently owned by the Big Four themselves. As historian Richard White documents in Railroaded, the Central Pacific's financial records were so thoroughly destroyed by the Big Four that the full extent of their self-dealing may never be known. For all the corruption and suffering that surrounded its construction, there came a moment in the spring of 1869 when the Transcontinental Railroad became something almost mythological, a race. Because the Pacific Railroad Act had made a fatally competitive decision. It had not assigned each company a specific endpoint. It had simply said they would build toward each other until they met, which meant that every additional mile either company built was additional land grants, additional government bonds, additional money. So by 1868, with both companies converging on Utah, the construction became a flat-out sprint. The Union Pacific's track-laying crews, under the command of the Casement brothers, were legendary for their pace. They could lay 4 miles of track in a day under good conditions. But the Central Pacific's Chinese workers were determined to beat them. In April 1869, just weeks before the final connection, the Central Pacific's crews laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track in a single day, a record that had been publicly doubted before it was set and has never been broken since. This feat, documented contemporaneously in newspaper accounts, including the San Francisco Alta California, and recounted in detail by Stephen Ambrose, was a logistical and human masterpiece. Every spike, every rail, every fishplate had to be staged along the route in advance, carried by an army of men working in perfect coordination. 10 miles of track, 3,520 rails, 28,160 spikes, driven in less than 12 hours of work. The two companies were eventually forced to stop building and pick a meeting point, because their surveyors had actually passed each other, laying parallel grades that never connected. Congress intervened and designated Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, as the meeting point. May 10, 1869, the Golden Spike. On May 10, 1869, a crowd gathered at Promontory Summit, a desolate, wind-swept plateau in northern Utah, to witness the completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad. The ceremony featured 2 locomotives facing each other across a gap of 1 rail's length, the Jupiter, representing the Central Pacific, and engine number 119, representing the Union Pacific. A ceremonial last rail was laid, made of polished California laurel wood, and then came the famous Golden Spike, actually made of 17.6-carat gold, inscribed with the words, "May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the 2 great oceans of the world." Leland Stanford of the Central Pacific and Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific were each given a silver-handled hammer connected by telegraph wire to a special transmitter. When the hammer struck the spike, the impact would send a signal to telegraph offices across the country. Stanford swung. He missed the spike entirely. Durant swung. He also missed. It didn't matter. The telegraph operator, anticipating the moment, sent the signal anyway. A single dot, the Morse code signal agreed upon in advance. That meant the signal flashed across telegraph lines to every city in the country simultaneously. In San Francisco, fire bells rang. In New York, the bells of Trinity Church pealed. In Chicago, a parade formed within minutes. In Washington, D.C., a 100-gun salute was fired. The continent was connected. And as we noted, the Chinese workers who had made this possible, who had drilled through granite mountains and survived Sierra Nevada winters and built 10 miles of track in a single day, were not at the ceremony. They were not invited. The Golden Spike itself was immediately removed for safekeeping. It now resides at the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford University, a university named, with breathtaking irony, for the man who missed the ceremonial blow. It shrank the country. Before the railroad, crossing the continent took months. After the railroad, it took 1 week. Think about what that means. The psychological distance between New York and San Francisco, which had been essentially equivalent to the distance between Earth and another planet, collapsed virtually overnight. Americans who had never seriously considered traveling to California suddenly could, and they did. Passenger traffic between the coasts exploded. Businesses that had operated only in regional markets suddenly had a continental market. Mail that took months to deliver now arrived in days. Information flowed faster than anyone had previously imagined possible. According to Walter Licht's economic history working for the railroad didn't just change transportation, it changed the fundamental pace of American economic life. It made national markets possible. It made national companies possible. It made modern capitalism, in its American form, possible. Created cities. The Transcontinental Railroad didn't just connect existing cities, it created new ones, virtually from nothing, at every major junction and supply point along its route. Cheyenne, Wyoming was established as a Union Pacific construction camp in July 1867. Within months, it had a population of over 4,000 people and was already being called the Magic City of the Plains. Today's the state capital. Ogden, Utah, became a major railroad hub and grew rapidly into a substantial city. Reno, Nevada was essentially created by the railroad. Dozens of other towns across Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada owe their existence and, in some cases, their survival to the railroad's roots. The railroad also transformed existing cities. Omaha, Nebraska, as the eastern terminus of the Union Pacific, became one of the most important transportation hubs in the country virtually overnight. Sacramento consolidated its position as the economic capital of inland California. And Chicago, already growing rapidly, was supercharged by the railroad into the monstrous, magnificent metropolis that would soon become the second-largest city in the United States. Chicago's position as the hub, connecting the Transcontinental Railroad to the Eastern Rail Network, made it, as historian William Cronon argues in his brilliant book Nature's Metropolis, the economic capital of the American interior. It transformed agriculture. Before the railroad, the vast agricultural potential of the Great Plains was essentially theoretical. Farmers could grow wheat or corn, but getting it to markets in the East was so expensive and difficult that the profit margins were brutally thin or non-existent. The railroad changed everything. Suddenly, wheat grown in Nebraska could be shipped to Chicago in days and loaded onto ships bound for New York or Liverpool within a week. The Great Plains, which had once seemed like a barrier to be crossed, became the most productive agricultural region on Earth. The Homestead Act of 1862, passed the same year as the Pacific Railroad Act, had theoretically opened the Great Plains to settlers. But it was the railroad that actually made settlement practical. The railroad companies, eager to sell their land, grants, and generate traffic for their lines, actively recruited settlers from the eastern United States and from Europe, running advertising campaigns in multiple languages, promising cheap land and prosperity. According to the National Archives, the railroad companies sold approximately 170 million acres of land to settlers over the following decades, land that had been granted to them by the federal government, land that had been guaranteed by treaty to native nations, and which was now being sold to white settlers to pay railroad debts. It drove industrialization. The railroad didn't just benefit from American industry, it became the engine that drove it. The demand for steel rails, locomotives, rolling stock, bridges, tunnels, and all the infrastructure of the railroad network created an industrial boom unlike anything the country had previously experienced. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, locomotive factories in Philadelphia and New York, iron foundries across New England and the Midwest, all of them feeding the insatiable appetite of the expanding rail network. By 1880, the United States had more miles of railroad track than all of Europe combined. By 1890, the total exceeded 163,000 miles, a web of steel, connecting virtually every significant town and city in the country. This network was the physical foundation of American industrial supremacy. When historians and economists try to explain why the United States became the world's dominant economic power by the early 20th century, the railroad and the industrial ecosystem it created is usually at or near the top of the list. The human cost revisited. And yet we cannot complete this picture without returning to the human costs, because the economic transformation wrought by the railroad was not distributed equally, and in many cases was built on explicit exploitation. The Chinese workers who built the Central Pacific faced legal discrimination in California that the railroad had done nothing to alleviate. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, enacted just 13 years after the Golden Spike Ceremony, specifically banned Chinese laborers from entering the United States and denied citizenship to Chinese people already here. The men who had built the railroad that made California's economic growth possible were legally barred from benefiting from that growth. The Irish workers faced discrimination of a different kind, the relentless condescension of a class system that valued them as muscle but not as citizens. Many ended up in company towns, living in company housing, shopping at company stores, perpetually in debt to the same companies that employed them, a system of debt bondage documented extensively in labor histories of the period. The native nations of the Great Plains suffered consequences that were, in the most literal sense, catastrophic. The destruction of the bison, the flood of settlers, and the military campaigns enabled by railroad logistics combined to destroy cultures that had existed for centuries. The Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and dozens of other nations were forced onto reservations, their sovereignty eliminated, their traditional economies destroyed. This is not ancient history. The communities descended from those nations are still living with the consequences today. 150 years later, what is the actual legacy of the first Transcontinental Railroad? The template for modern infrastructure. The Transcontinental Railroad established the fundamental model for large-scale infrastructure in America: government subsidy, private construction, and corporate profit, with all the opportunities for both achievement and corruption that this combination entails. Every major American infrastructure project since the interstate highway system, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Internet itself, which was originally a government-funded military communications network, follows variations on the template established by the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. The questions it raised: how much should government subsidize private enterprise? Who bears the costs and who receives the benefits? How do we balance economic development with the rights of those in the path of that development? Are questions that American democracy is still debating. The creation of standard time. Here's something that almost nobody knows about the railroad's legacy. It created time itself, or at least the standardized version of time that governs modern life. Before the railroad, time was local. Every city set its clocks by the sun, local solar time. This was fine when most people never traveled more than 50 miles from home. But when railroads began connecting cities hundreds of miles apart, the chaos of dozens of different local times made scheduling practically impossible. In 1883, the American railroad companies, acting through the American Railway Association, unilaterally divided the country into 4 time zones and standardized clocks within each zone. This happened before Congress acted. The railroads simply imposed standardized time on the country because they needed it to function. The federal government didn't officially adopt Railroad Standard Time until the Standard Time Act of 1918. By then, it had already been the de facto standard for 35 years, simply because the railroads had made it necessary. So the next time you glance at your phone and check the time Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific, you are looking at a legacy of the railroad. The inspiration for every transcontinental project since. The first Transcontinental Railroad inspired imitations across the globe. Canada completed its own Transcontinental Railroad, the Canadian Pacific Railway, in 1885. Russia began the Trans-Siberian Railway in 1891, completing it in 1916. Australia, South Africa, and dozens of other nations built transcontinental railroads in the decades that followed, each one following and crediting the American precedent. The idea that a nation could be physically unified by a ribbon of steel, that the distances of a continent could be conquered by engineering and human will, was an American idea, Crazy Judah's idea, Lincoln's idea, and ultimately, the idea of the tens of thousands of workers who drove it into reality with their hands.